The shadow of constant availability, to always be available, to answer every call, to respond to every demand, is to live under an invisible weight that the soul eventually begins to resist. There is a subtle shadow that forms when one gives themselves without pause, when one's life is shaped around the expectations of others rather than the quiet urgings of the inner world. This shadow does not declare itself immediately. At first, constant availability feels like generosity, like loyalty, like love. It gives the illusion of harmony, of usefulness, of being needed. But beneath this surface lies a hidden distortion, for what seems like selflessness can often mask a deeper avoidance. The avoidance of hearing the voice within that is asking for solitude, asking for space, asking for renewal. The shadow of constant availability emerges when one becomes so absorbed in serving external calls that the inner life is neglected. The psyche, which longs for balance, begins to fracture under this neglect. A person who is endlessly available risks becoming estranged from their own desires and instincts. For every moment given to others without reflection is a moment withheld from one's own unfolding. This is how one loses authenticity, not in a single act, but in 1,000 small surrenders to duties that do not belong to the soul. There is also a collective force at play. The world, with its relentless rhythm, thrives on availability. Technology, relationships, institutions, all conspire to keep us tethered, reachable at all times, as if presence were owed rather than offered. And so, the individual finds themselves trapped in a cycle where their worth is measured by how quickly they respond, how much they give, how often they are seen. This cycle tightens the grip of the shadow, because the more one conforms to these expectations, the more one's identity fuses with the role of the ever-available caretaker, friend, partner, or worker. Eventually, the mask becomes indistinguishable from the face. But the unconscious does not rest. It speaks through wariness, through resentment, through the quiet emptiness that follows endless giving. This is the language of the neglected self. The shadow presses against the edges of consciousness, reminding us that what is repressed will always seek expression. If one continues to silence this voice, it may appear in sudden bursts of anger, in withdrawal that feels like collapse rather than choice, or in the dull ache of depression. These are not random afflictions. They are the psychic cost of ignoring the inner demand for boundaries. The shadow of constant availability also blinds us to the motives of others. When one is perpetually open, perpetually accessible, the doors are left wide not only for love and connection, but also for exploitation. Those who seek to take without giving, those who thrive on draining energy, are drawn to those who cannot say no. In this way, constant availability feeds cycles of imbalance in relationships, reinforcing the illusion that one must always serve in order to be valued. This illusion corrodes the possibility of authentic exchange, where both giving and receiving are held in balance. To see this shadow clearly is to recognize that availability without discernment is not virtue, but fragmentation. It is the gradual erosion of one's own center. The psyche cannot thrive when it is endlessly dispersed outward. It must be gathered, it must be reclaimed. It must be allowed to move in rhythm with its own depths, rather than the insatiable demands of the world. Withdrawal as a rite of transformation. Withdrawal is often misunderstood as retreat or weakness, but in the depths of the psyche, it is a sacred rite, a deliberate turning inward that signals the beginning of transformation. When one ceases to be constantly available, a threshold is crossed, a liminal space where the familiar demands of the external world are momentarily suspended, and the inner world can finally speak. This turning away from external expectation is not an escape, but a necessary passage into self-possession, a journey through the quiet corridors of the soul where one encounters both the unclaimed aspects of the self and the silent wisdom that has been long ignored. The act of withdrawing carries an inherent tension. For much of life, the psyche is habituated to respond, to serve, to please, and to be measured by how one attends to others. To step back from this pattern is to confront discomfort, the uneasy recognition of one's own needs, the fear of judgment, and the anxiety of absence. Yet this discomfort is essential, for it signals the presence of growth. Without the tension of withdrawal, the self cannot awaken to its full depth. The ritual of stepping away, even briefly, illuminates what has been submerged beneath the incessant activity of availability, revealing desires, strengths, and insights that cannot surface amidst the constant noise of outer obligations. In this sacred turning inward, one discovers that silence is fertile. The mind, long habituated to the chatter of external influence, begins to recalibrate. Thoughts that were scattered, fragmented by endless calls and interruptions, begin to settle into patterns of reflection and clarity. Emotions, previously smothered beneath the weight of compliance, rise into consciousness and demand acknowledgement. In solitude, the psyche encounters its own rhythms and patterns, sensing where energy has been dissipated and where it may be reclaimed. The withdrawal is not merely absence from the world, but presence to oneself, a profound recognition that the inner life is the crucible in which true transformation occurs. There is also a psychological paradox inherent in this rite. Withdrawal, though it removes one from habitual relational patterns, often intensifies one's sense of connection to life. By stepping back, one can observe relationships, social dynamics, and personal patterns from a wider perspective, seeing with clarity the energies that were previously invisible. This expanded vision allows for conscious choice rather than reactive habit. It is in this space that one begins to understand the difference between giving from compulsion and giving from authentic desire, between presence that nourishes and presence that depletes. The rite of withdrawal also awakens the dormant creativity of the psyche. In the absence of constant distraction, the mind opens to imagination, to reflection, and to the archetypal currents that underlie personal experience. Thoughts and visions that were previously submerged in routine begin to emerge, providing guidance and insight. Symbols, dreams, and intuitions become accessible, offering the individual a map for inner growth and alignment with deeper truths. In this way, withdrawal is transformative, not only because it conserves energy, because it creates the conditions in which the self can encounter its own depth and participate consciously in its unfolding. To undertake withdrawal is to honor the cycles of inner life. Just as nature rests and regenerates in darkness, so too does the soul require moments of absence from the demands of others. This is not retreat for the sake of avoidance, nor is it indulgence. It is a necessary rhythm of growth, a rite of passage that allows one to reclaim energy, to confront hidden aspects of the psyche, and to emerge into life with renewed presence and authentic authority. The awakening of boundaries, Boundaries are often perceived as rigid structures, as defensive walls erected to keep the world at a distance. Yet their true nature is far subtler and more profound. They are thresholds, sacred lines that define the space of the self, a recognition that the psyche is not an infinite reservoir to be endlessly drawn upon, but a finite, living organism that requires care, attention, and reverence. When one stops being constantly available, these boundaries awaken, not through force or declaration, but through the quiet, persistent recognition that energy must flow with discernment, that presence must be measured, and that the self has the right to say no without guilt. The awakening of boundaries is both psychological and spiritual. On the psychological plane, it is the recognition of limits, of how much one can give without dissolving into exhaustion, how much attention can be offered without losing sight of inner necessity. This recognition is rarely sudden. It arises gradually as the mind notices tension in relationships, subtle patterns of exploitation, and the repeated depletion of one's vitality. It is a process of becoming conscious of where one ends and where the demands of others begin, and it requires a courage that is often underestimated, for asserting boundaries can provoke resistance, misunderstanding, and even confrontation. Spiritually, boundaries are a declaration of respect for the sacred interior. By ceasing to be perpetually available, one signals that the inner world is not a commodity, but a sanctuary, deserving of reverence and protection. The psyche, which has long been fragmented by overextension, begins to consolidate, to gather strength, and to assert its presence in ways that are authentic and sustaining. In this light, boundaries are not exclusionary. They are invitations for others to encounter the self on terms of honesty and mutual respect. They allow relationships to transform from dependency into dialogue, from drain into reciprocity, from expectation into conscious engagement. The awakening of boundaries also brings clarity to perception. When one has not established limits, interactions with others often become entangled and confusing, with the demands of the world bleeding into the desires of the self. Boundaries provide a frame through which one can observe these dynamics with discernment, separating what is truly essential from what is merely habitual or imposed. They illuminate the difference between authentic connection and obligation, between nourishing engagement and depleting consumption. In this space of clarity, the self can act with intention rather than reaction, respond with generosity rather than compulsion, and maintain presence without surrendering integrity. Moreover, boundaries cultivate a profound sense of inner authority. The moment one claims the right to say no, to withhold, to pause, a shift occurs in the psyche. The self becomes its own measure, no longer defined solely by the recognition or approval of others. One begins to align action with personal values and inner truth. This alignment fosters confidence, self-respect, and resilience. For the psyche learns that its energy is sacred, and that giving it away indiscriminately diminishes, rather than nourishes life. The awakening of boundaries is not a one-time event, but a dynamic process. It requires continual attention, reflection, and adjustment as life evolves and relationships change. Each act of discernment strengthens the psyche, each refusal reinforces integrity, and each conscious withdrawal replenishes the reservoir of energy necessary for meaningful engagement. In this way, boundaries are not barriers. They are living instruments of balance, conduits for authentic presence, and the foundation upon which the self can flourish in both solitude and connection. The alchemy of rejection and loss. When one begins to withdraw from constant availability, a peculiar alchemy begins to unfold in life, an intricate transformation where rejection and loss are not merely painful events but crucibles of growth. The psyche, conditioned to equate presence with value, initially experiences absence as a threat. Friends, colleagues, and loved ones may resist, misunderstand, or even depart, and the heart instinctively recoils at this seeming betrayal. Yet within this discomfort lies the seed of profound insight. Rejection and loss are not punishments, but instruments that strip away illusion and reveal the true shape of connection. Rejection, when encountered consciously, forces a confrontation with the reality of relationships. It illuminates which connections are sustained by genuine mutual respect and which rely on dependency, convenience, or unconscious expectations. Those who disappear or react with anger to one's absence reveal the boundaries of their own understanding and attachment. In this revelation, the individual gains clarity, no longer obscured by the comforting illusions of constant availability. The alchemy lies in the recognition that loss, while painful, is also a cleansing force, purging superficial bonds and creating space for authenticity to emerge. The experience of loss also awakens latent resilience within the psyche. When one loses the external reinforcement of presence, approval, attention, or the habitual rhythm of interaction, the self is compelled to return inward, to rediscover its own source of nourishment. This inward turn is transformative, for it encourages a reliance on inner authority rather than external validation. The soul, long habituated to shape itself around others' expectations, learns to define its own value, to affirm its own worth, and to cultivate an inner stability that is not contingent on the whims of the world. There is also a subtle paradox in this alchemy. The very act of withdrawing may initially generate fear of isolation, but yet isolation is precisely the medium through which integration occurs. In solitude, the psyche can observe emotional reactions without immediate interference, can reflect on attachment patterns without external pressures, and can explore desires and needs previously suppressed by constant engagement. Rejection and loss, then, serve as catalysts for this necessary solitude, for without the friction of absence, the inner self might remain dormant, never fully confronting its own depths or discovering the hidden structures of its consciousness. Moreover, this alchemy shapes the way one approaches future relationships. When one has been tested by absence, by rejection, and by the departure of those unable to honor boundaries, there emerges a capacity for discernment and compassion. One no longer clings to connections out of fear, but engages with presence that is conscious and intentional. Love and friendship are now chosen rather than assumed, freely given rather than demanded. And this intentionality transforms ordinary interactions into authentic encounters. The fire of rejection and the erosion of loss are, in essence, refining forces. They dissolve attachments to superficial patterns, dissolve dependency upon constant affirmation, and leave the psyche distilled to its essential qualities. Through this alchemy, one begins to recognize that what endures is not the mere presence of others, but the integrity, depth, and intentionality of one's own being. In this way, withdrawal and its consequences become instruments of awakening, transforming absence, rejection, and loss into the foundation upon which a more conscious, resilient, and authentic life can be constructed. The return of inner authority. The return of inner authority is a subtle yet profound awakening that occurs when one ceases to be endlessly available to the demands of the external world. In the ordinary rhythm of life, the self often surrenders its power unconsciously, allowing choices, moods, and even self-worth to be dictated by the expectations and needs of others. To reclaim authority over one's own life is not an act of defiance, but a reassertion of alignment with the deeper currents of the psyche, an affirmation that one's energy, attention, and presence are not commodities to be endlessly exchanged, but sacred resources to be directed with discernment and intention. This return begins with the recognition of autonomy. When constant availability is suspended, the mind confronts the reality of freedom to choose, freedom to prioritize, freedom to align action with inner truth rather than external compulsion. This is a revelation that is both liberating and disquieting. The psyche, habituated to reactive compliance, may resist, producing feelings of guilt, fear, or anxiety. Yet these feelings are not obstacles, but indicators that the self is awakening to its own sovereignty. The tension itself becomes a guide, pointing toward areas where authority has been ceded and where conscious reclamation is required. Inner authority is intimately connected with discernment. It allows one to differentiate between genuine obligations and imposed pressures, between opportunities that nurture growth and demands that drain vitality. With this discernment comes clarity in action. Decisions are no longer dictated by fear of judgment, desire for approval, or habitual habit, but by alignment with purpose, values, and authentic desire. The self begins to operate as a sovereign agent, responsive rather than reactive, intentional rather than compelled, anchored in a depth of being that cannot be swayed by superficial currents. The emergence of inner authority also transforms relationships. Those who encounter a person grounded in their own sovereignty perceive a presence that is calm, deliberate, and self-assured. Interactions become exchanges between equals rather than dynamics of obligation and control. Respect arises naturally, not from coercion or manipulation, but from the clarity and consistency of one's own centeredness. Others may initially resist this shift, as patterns of dependency and expectation are disrupted, but over time, genuine connection is strengthened because it is now chosen freely, not extracted through constant availability. Moreover, inner authority cultivates resilience. When one's sense of self is no longer contingent upon external affirmation, the psyche becomes fortified against the fluctuations of approval, attention, or recognition. Emotional equilibrium is no longer dependent upon constant validation. It rests upon a foundation of inner certainty. This is not rigidity or inflexibility, but a flexible sovereignty that allows engagement with life's demands without surrendering the core of one's being. Decisions are informed by wisdom rather than reaction, and action flows from integrity rather than necessity. The return of inner authority also awakens a deeper dialogue with the unconscious. In reclaiming sovereignty, one becomes more attuned to inner impulses, intuitive insights, and archetypal currents that guide life beyond conscious calculation. The self, once dispersed and reactive, consolidates into a coherent center capable of discerning patterns, recognizing cycles, and making choices that honor both personal truth and the greater rhythm of existence. In this way, the return of inner authority is not merely a practical reorganization of life. It is a profound psychic realignment, a reclaiming of the center from which authentic living emanates, and a restoration of the sacred trust between the conscious self and the inner depths, the transformation of outer reality. When one ceases to be endlessly available, the outer world begins to respond in ways that are subtle yet unmistakable. Relationships, opportunities, and interactions are reframed by the presence of discernment and intentionality. The act of withdrawing does not create isolation. Rather, it filters life through a lens of authenticity, allowing only those connections and engagements that resonate with the self's deeper truth to remain. What was once chaotic or draining becomes clarified, as the energy formerly scattered across endless demands is now concentrated and directed with purpose. This transformation is not immediate nor dramatic in the conventional sense, but it is pervasive. Those around a person who honors their own boundaries sense the shift. Responses change, respect replaces entitlement, attentiveness replaces expectation, and engagement is offered with conscious choice, rather than assumed obligation. The energy of the individual, once diffused by constant availability, now radiates a quiet authority, drawing people and situations that align with this renewed presence. In this way, the outer reality mirrors the inner transformation, creating a feedback loop that reinforces the self-sovereignty and integrity. Opportunities also emerge differently when one is no longer perpetually accessible. The psyche, freed from reactive engagement, perceives situations with clarity, intuition, and discernment. Choices are made with awareness rather than compulsion, and actions are taken from alignment with values rather than fear of absence or rejection. Life begins to present experiences that are congruent with the individual's authentic self, filtering out the superficial or misaligned in favor of what nurtures growth, creativity, and purpose. Even the flow of daily interactions becomes richer and more meaningful. Conversations deepen, collaborations become more intentional, and connections are no longer predicated on convenience or habit. In stepping away from incessant availability, one awakens to the principle that outer reality is not separate from the inner state. It is a reflection of the energies, boundaries, and authority cultivated within. Through this conscious withdrawal, life shifts from fragmentation to coherence, from reaction to intentional engagement, and from dispersal to alignment